They come silently out of the dark, like creatures from a half-forgotten dream. Some are vampires. Many are predatory. Bats have long been victims of popular myth and superstition. Since the appearance of Count Dracula, they've had a bad press. To set the record straight, bats are not aggressive, they are not blind, and they certainly don't get tangled up in long hair. Only now, at the 11th hour, are we beginning to understand the truth about bats and the vital role they play in sustaining life on this planet. And that's largely due to the work of a handful of dedicated scientists like Merlin Tuttle. He has observed more kinds of bats in more places than anyone in history. Bats are a passion for him, and with good reason. Recent research is showing that far from being the nightmare creatures of popular myth, bats are a source of wonder, and their diversity is amazing. It's also been discovered that they may be crucial to life on Earth. Bats live almost everywhere. They are found on every continent except Antarctica. There are over 100 species in North America alone. Bracken Cave in Texas contains the single largest colony of bats in the world. Between 20 and 40 million Mexican freetails come here. It's the densest concentration of warm-blooded animals on Earth. They arrive during the summer to give birth and raise their young. Each square foot of cave wall is covered by up to 500 tiny, pink, hairless bat pups. The adults and pups roost separately, forming pink and brown patches on the walls. Female bats give birth to only one baby a year. Each mother, using both sound and smell, is able to find and nurse her single offspring several times a day in total darkness in a 600-foot-long cave. The young are large when born, about a third of adult size, and within 3 to 4 weeks they're exercising their wings. Their first attempt at flight is crucial. The floor of the cave is a seething mass of carnivorous beetles. Young bats have to leap off into the air in complete darkness, having never flown before, and avoid several collisions each second. A mistake now could prove fatal. The beetles and their larvae make short work of a young bat, and within minutes, only a few bones remain. Some 70% of the world's bats eat insects. One bat can eat between 500 and 1,000 mosquito-sized insects in a single hour. The 20 million or so occupants of Bracken Cave eat over 250 tons each evening while flying over the surrounding farmland. The California leaf-nosed bat is a highly specialized hunter. It can actually detect the tiny footsteps of the cricket. In the deserts of the American Southwest, bats play a vital role in maintaining the fragile ecosystem. Many familiar desert plants are dependent on bats for their survival. During the day, hummingbirds and insects feed at the flowers of the agave, but these creatures play a negligible role in the pollination of this plant. By day, the flowers are inactive. They only release pollen after nightfall, and it's now that nectar is secreted. It's this rich source of energy that attracts the bats. As each lesser long-nosed bat probes the flowers for food, showers of pollen cover its face and body. The bats unwittingly pollinate hundreds of flowers in a single evening. Many cactus plants also depend on bats for pollination. Their flowers open after sundown, ready for their nocturnal visitors. The saguaro blossoms don't open until midnight, so they don't compete with the other cacti. It's a remarkable example of the precision with which nature works. The long-nosed bats have muzzles that are perfectly shaped to fit deep inside the cactus blossoms, like keys in a lock. One by one, the bats dip their heads into the blossoms, and one by one, the saguaro flowers are pollinated. The bats return to their roost, their faces covered with pollen that hasn't rubbed off in other flowers. It's a valuable source of protein and eagerly licked off. Without the bats, many of the desert's most important plants could die out, threatening an entire ecosystem. Yet it's not just in this harsh environment that the presence of bats is essential. In tropical rainforests, such as those in French Guiana, bats have a crucial role to play. These rich forests are the home of more than 90% of all the terrestrial plant and animal species. The fine balance that exists between them, which took millions of years to develop, can be destroyed in a single afternoon. These are familiar images, environmental cliches even, the destruction of another area of rainforest. But what's often overlooked is that devastation like this can regenerate, given the opportunity. It's through the work of scientists like Dr. Scott Morey, a leading rainforest specialist, that we are only now discovering the immense importance of bats in this process.
How important are bats to regrowth of forest in a clearing like this?
Merlin, bats are vital to the reestablishment of tropical rainforest after large-scale disturbance. 2.5 years ago, we came here, and the only plants in this field were plants whose seeds were brought in by bats. Later on, even today, we can see that the majority of the plants here are bat-dispersed plants. It's important to remember that the conditions for other kinds of plants to come in are first established by these bat-dispersed plants. It's only then that plants that are dispersed by birds, and later on plants that are dispersed by other mammals, such as primates, can become established. We must remember that any conservation program in the tropics must give high priority to the conservation of bats. because if we take bats out of this ecosystem, we cannot have normal regeneration of tropical rainforests. Merlin, look. Here we have three different very excellent examples of bat-dispersed plants. Here's the classic, a Cecropia. Here's a Visme in the background. And here's a Solanum in fruit. Look at this Solanum. It has a very classic kind of bat fruit. Let's take a look at this fruit. We'll open it up. And you can see all of these very small seeds on the inside. The bats will come in here and they actually know which plants are going to have ripe fruit on any given night. They'll come in here, swallow the whole fruit, carry that fruit away, and digest it within, and pass these seeds out within 20 minutes.
Right.
And I think this is one of the most important things that we have to remember, is that bats pass the seeds out relatively rapidly.
And in flight.
And in flight. And this is one of the reasons that they're so important in getting those seeds into large-scale disturbance areas.
This species of Solanum holds its ripening fruits vertically, making life a little easier for the bats. The fruits of the Cecropia hang down in bunches. The bats come to feed on the seed-packed fleshy fingers. Birds also feed on these fruits, but it's primarily bats that carry the seeds into clearings. Many plants seem to have evolved their seed-laden fruits specifically with bats in mind. The piper has fruits that grow vertically along its stems while the leaves hang down, enabling the bats to feed in flight. It has been estimated that a Corollia bat can disperse up to 60,000 seeds in one night. Females have to continue feeding despite the fact that they are nursing their single offspring, which weighs almost half their own body weight. The youngster, only a few days old, clings on to its mother, using its feet and thumbs, even in flight. The male has no such encumbrance. The female eats the piper like corn on the cob, and then discards the tough stalk. Within minutes, the undigested seeds pass through her body and are scattered as she flies over the open patches of land. Within 2 or 3 years of being felled, the scars on the face of the forest are already beginning to disappear, the start of a healing process begun by fruit-eating bats. Yet despite their vital role, bats continue to be exterminated throughout the world. Far out in the Pacific, bats face a precarious future. An enormous B-52 thunders into the air as it leaves the tiny island of Guam. There's been an American military presence here since the First World War, but the island was home to fruit bats long before humans ever set foot here. The forests on Guam were originally the habitat of 3 species of bats. 2 are now extinct. The surviving Mariana's fruit bat has declined in numbers from many thousands to between 400 and 500 and is now an endangered species. 40% of the island's plants rely on the bats for either pollination or seed dispersal. The principal reason for such a catastrophic decline in bat numbers is they have been hunted for food. These bats were illegally killed on neighboring islands and smuggled in to be eaten on Guam, where they are a popular delicacy. The holes in the wing show they were killed by shotgun pellets. It's a pitiful sight, and one which marks a serious threat to the ecology of the whole island, because many species of plants have lost their key pollinator or seed disperser. Today, tons of fruit, and even the fleshy parts of these liana flowers, go uneaten each night. They become food for fruit flies. As a result, the fruit fly population has exploded and is now seriously threatening commercial fruit growing on Guam. The remaining colony of bats now lives within the safety of the airbase, right at the end of the runway, where they are carefully protected. With luck, the Marianas fruit bat will be saved from extinction. But bats are seriously threatened throughout the world. If these gentle animals are to survive, generations of human ignorance, fear, and greed must be overcome. Bats face probably their biggest threat from people in Southeast Asia. Ironically, the old Chinese temples are covered in motifs of bats. They're considered a symbol of good health and prosperity. As dusk falls over the Buddhist monastery of Khao Chong Pran in Thailand, an amazing spectacle forms in the air. Millions of bats stream out of their daytime roost and spread over the surrounding forests and farmland. This was, until recently, quite a common sight throughout the region. But human disturbance of the caves in which the bats roost has caused a massive decline in bat numbers. It's a familiar story throughout the world. Fortunately, this area is owned by the local monastery and has been protected for 9 years. In that time, the number of bats has steadily increased. There are now over 6 million under the watchful eye of a warden. Without this intervention, the colony would have been lost. Most of the half-dozen species that roost in the cave are insect eaters, devouring more than 35 million pounds of insects each year, and the bats are essential to maintaining the balance of nature. The others are fruit eaters and are a key factor in the commercial fruit trade of Southeast Asia. Throughout the world's tropical markets, about 70% of the commercial fruits come from plants that in the wild rely on bats for pollination or seed dispersal. The markets are full of them. They include guavas, peaches, avocados, bananas, mangoes, and plantain. The most important fruit of Southeast Asia in commercial terms is the durian, which adds $120 million a year to local economies. The flowers of the durian begin to open as the sun goes down. As night falls, the flowers produce nectar and pollen, ready for the arrival of the bats. The dawn bat is a key pollinator of the durian. As it feeds on the flower's nectar, the bat is in fact ensuring that the plant will bear fruit this season. The loss of the bats poses serious problems for the future of this important fruit-growing industry. Within hours of blossoming, the large white petals begin to fall. Birds don't have the opportunity to pollinate the flowers, and the majority of insects are far too small. If the blooms have not been visited by a bat in this time, they will remain unfertilized and no fruit will be produced. In the wild, Bananas also rely on bats. Although commercially grown bananas do not require pollination, wild stocks must be maintained in order to provide the fresh genetic strains needed to keep cultivated varieties healthy. The bat's face shows just how effective it is at spreading the banana's pollen. At daybreak, there's little evidence of the bat's activities. By now, they are pouring back into the safety of their cave. But sadly, not as many will return as originally left. Although the bats are protected within the cave, poachers have spread their nets in the surrounding countryside. Once the bat's feet and wings become entangled in the net, there's little chance of it escaping. Throughout Southeast Asia, many thousands are caught like this each night. The meager amount of flesh on their bones is in big demand. It's even considered by some to be an aphrodisiac. Many species of bats are faced with extinction because of such indiscriminate hunting. For some species, it's already too late. They simply no longer exist. But bats are worth far more alive than dead. Among their many valuable contributions, they produce excellent fertilizer. Once a week, the monks permit local villagers to enter certain parts of the cave where their very high roofs minimize disturbance to the bats. Under the watchful eyes of the Buddha, they venture deep into the cave system. These people are not here to collect the bats, but their droppings, which fall to the floor of the cave in a constant shower. Though the collection of bat guano is no longer economically practical in industrialized countries, it continues to be a key resource in developing economies. It is an extremely rich fertilizer. 6 million bats provide an income of almost $100,000 a year for the monastery. The cost of employing a warden to protect the cave is almost insignificant. As the number of bats continues to increase, so does the amount of guano, which in turn increases the income for the monastery. However, this industry is small change when compared to the potential value of other life that requires bat guano for its survival. Countless thousands of unique organisms, from fish and insects to bacteria and fungi, would die without the energy they derive from bat droppings. Just one spoonful may contain up to 1,000 species of bacteria, many of which are of potentially great value in solving human problems. Their usefulness is only now being realized by microbiologists. Some bacteria already under study show promise of helping us detoxify industrial waste, improve detergents, even help in the production of alcohol for fuel and antibiotics. In Australia, people are realizing, perhaps in the nick of time, just how critical bats are to the survival of their forests. In New South Wales, these colonies of gray-headed and black flying foxes are only 1/10 of their former population. The reason for their drastic decline is quite simple. They were shot, burned with flamethrowers, and dynamited to the verge of extinction by local people and farmers who blamed them for damaging commercial fruit crops. The fact is that under normal conditions, the bats only eat fruit that is too ripe for commercial harvesting. On average, birds do more damage to crops, but because of popular misconceptions, bats got the blame and were massacred. Recent legislation granted legal protection for the flying foxes of New South Wales. Under the wing of the Ku-ring-gai Bat Committee, any orphaned or abandoned youngsters are cared for by a group of women who meet regularly to compare notes about bats.
This is better.
She's great.
No. You've had your turn. It's Adam's turn now. He hasn't had a turn and he hasn't had a brush.
Over here. Look, she's dying to have a bit of that.
No, she's really...
Really bad.
No, Max's are only little ones. You know, they sort of, it comes out about that far.
No, this really collapsed.
There is apple.
there is apple
There is
there.
a piece of apple.
No, Max, you're not coming on, Mummy. Max, Mummy says no, one at a time, please. One at a time, please. Foot don't come down. It just won't come down.
And
I know you haven't lost
there you
it.
go.
Might have, I didn't.
All right.
These flying foxes are not kept as pets. Most will be released back into the wild.
Do you know, I don't think it's the apple itself. I don't think it's the taste of the apple.
Visitors are encouraged to meet the bats at close quarters and see just how gentle, attractive, and intelligent they are. Seen at this close range, it's easy to understand why some scientists think flying foxes are primates, related to monkeys, apes, and humans. Large numbers of people now gather to watch the bats leave their treetop roosts at dusk and head off to feed. In doing so, the bats often pass over some familiar landmarks. At the Sydney Opera House, it's the first night of the season. The bats may travel many miles in search of food and once again play an important part in the pollination and seed dispersal of many economically valuable plants, including trees such as the ironwood, an important timber tree. Loss of the bats would pose a serious threat to the timber industry. Other plants too, like the bottlebrush, rely heavily on bats for pollination. But worldwide, it's not just economics that justify the importance of bats. In East Africa, the baobab tree is a familiar part of the landscape. The tree is home to a large number of birds, mammals, and other animals, so many, in fact, that it's known as the tree of life. The baobab relies on bats for the pollination of its flowers. Nectar is produced at the base of the large white petals as a tasty incentive for the bats to visit the flower. A female epauletted bat lands on the flower to feed. As it moves from nectary to nectary, its underside rubs against the mass of anthers hanging below, and the pollen is carried from flower to flower as the bat feeds. In another tree nearby, a male epauletted bat is performing his courtship display in the hope of attracting a mate. For the moment, she continues to feed. But the male persists. Eventually, the female approaches, an indication of her acceptance of the male as a mate. Bats are important seed dispersers here, too. This Rosetta bat is feeding on figs, the seeds of which will soon be shed over a large area. Most of the caves along the coast of Kenya were once important bat roosts. Sadly, many are now threatened. They are jeopardized by increasing numbers of people who disturb and even intentionally kill sleeping bats. Visits to these important roosts are kept to a minimum in order to reduce disturbance to the bats. They are, of course, completely harmless and can exist side by side with people in perfect harmony, provided the bats are left in peace. One little-known but very positive effect of the bat's presence is that they disperse the seeds of a local tree. The leaves of the neem tree are well known along the Kenya coast as an insect repellent. A few branches placed around exposed food keep the flies away and the tourist happy. One place where the future of bats is looking up is Austin, Texas. Crevices beneath the Congress Avenue Bridge are the daytime roost of about 1 million Mexican freetail bats. Just a few years ago, people feared the bats and petitioned city officials to get rid of them. But through the efforts of Bat Conservation International, public opinion gradually changed, and now the bats are appreciated and even regarded as a tourist attraction. Large numbers of people gather on summer evenings to watch the bats emerge. They eat 15 to 30,000 pounds of insects nightly, controlling pests throughout the area. To most people, a bat is just a bat, despite the fact that there are almost 1,000 species worldwide. Accompanied by Bert Grenches, one of the new breed of young bat enthusiasts, Merlin finds the deserts of West Texas a rich hunting ground.
Yeah, I think this is just what we've been looking for. We haven't seen water for a long ways.
And that'll stretch. Think you get it all the way?
Yeah, I think it's going to be just perfect fit. Yeah, we can put it.
Each species of bat makes its own unique ultrasonic sounds, too high for us to hear. With electronic help, it's possible to identify the species without ever seeing them.
Just lift it up about 6 or 8 inches.
Okay. Gosh, it's so fast.
A fine mist net strung low over the water is the easiest way to get a close look at them. The mesh of the net is so fine that by the time the bats detect it, it's too late. They are released from the nets immediately to minimize the stress of being caught.
Oh, looks like we got a freetail here.
Well, why do they call them freetails?
Well, they call them freetails because, unlike most bats, they have a little bare tail like a mouse. See the membrane here? Most bats have a membrane that comes all the way to the end of the tail. Oh, this is a big freetail bat. This is several times larger than the Mexican freetail bat that we just caught. In fact, these are quite rarely seen.
In all, there are 8 or 9 species feeding or drinking in this small area.
Hey, Bert, we got a ghost-faced bat here. See here, he has these really strange eyes that appear to be right back in his ears. and that's part of a very sophisticated navigation system that this bat has. There's no other bat in the United States that looks quite like him.
Nature has, over millions of years of evolution, produced a sonar system far more accurate than any yet developed by science. The huge differences in the faces of bats reflects each species' solution to the problem of turning its hearing into an effective echolocation system. Perhaps the most spectacular example of sonar detection occurs in the forests of Central and South America. There, in the warm, humid tropical night, there lives a bat whose echolocation is so well developed that it can detect an object as fine as a human hair, protruding a mere millimeter above the water's surface. It's a predatory species which eats fish and can detect the slightest ripple. Its sonic pulses have been slowed down 60 times so that we can hear them. Once a fish has been detected, the fish-eating bat homes in and, dragging its flattened, razor-sharp claws through the water, scoops up its prey. It seldom misses. Other species of carnivorous bats live in the same area. The rarely seen Crotopterus has a wingspan of over 2 feet. It's an efficient predator that catches a wide variety of small animals. Not all bats hunt for a living. Glossophaga is a true acrobat, hanging from flowers as it feeds and sipping nectar with a tongue as long as its body. But the stamp flower makes it pay for its meal. As it feeds, its back rubs against the flower's anthers. The bat unwittingly carries the pollen on its back from flower to flower. The rainforests of Central America are home to over 100 kinds of bats. Caves here are rare, so many species roost in hollow trees. It's always wise to check for snakes before venturing inside a hollow tree. Several species have taken up residence in the tree, such as the nectar-feeding Glossophaga. Nearby hang 1 or 2 Carolia bats. And in one corner, a vampire, the species responsible for people's misplaced horror of bats. It feeds exclusively on the blood of other mammals and birds, especially domestic ones on nearby farms. It silently lands and stealthily creeps along the branch. Heat detectors around its nose tell the bat where the blood vessels are closest to the surface. Licking softens up the skin while the chicken continues to sleep. An anticoagulant in the saliva helps the blood to flow freely. This is far more effective than the anticoagulants currently being used in the treatment of heart patients. Medical researchers are trying to isolate and synthesize it. The vampire may one day prove to be a lifesaver. The vampire is unique, a rare exception that's tainted public opinion about bats in general. There are, however, a large number that can only be described as endearing. Clustered beneath a leaf in a Costa Rican forest huddles a group of tiny, white, tent-making bats. They make a home for themselves by chewing along the midrib of a heliconia leaf, so that the two halves hang down, making a very effective tent that shelters them from the frequent rains. They will use a tent for several weeks before making a new one elsewhere. The adults are thumb-sized and pure white. The young are gray, and this one is being pestered by a mosquito. Once one starts to struggle, the whole group is disturbed and begins to shuffle around, trying to avoid the insect. Bats that live in tropical regions are active year-round, but those that live in temperate zones have to hibernate throughout the winter and present special problems in protecting them. In Hubbard's Cave in Tennessee, bats return each autumn to spend up to 6 months in a dormant state. Here, the overwintering animals are protected from human disturbance by an enormous 120-ton grill. The bats can come and go through the grill. The public is allowed into the cave during the summer when it's empty. During the winter, no one is allowed in, except once every 2 or 3 years when scientists must check on the bats. Hubbard's Cave is one of the 3 most important bat hibernating sites in the world. In all, 7 or 8 species spend the winter here. Thousands of endangered gray bats encrust the ceiling, living on reserves of fat built up prior to hibernation. The bats wake up at the slightest disturbance. If this happens too often, they use up their energy supplies. As a result, before the arrival of spring, they simply run out of fuel and die. All visits to the cave are brief. The cavernous walls provide a range of temperatures from above 50 degrees Fahrenheit to below freezing, making it suitable for an unusually wide variety of species. The body temperature of this big brown bat falls to that of its surroundings. Its heartbeat slows dramatically, and its blood barely moves through its veins. The probe reads just over 30 degrees Fahrenheit. The animal is actually surviving below the freezing point. The eastern big-eared bat is one of North America's rarest species and gets its name for obvious reasons. A little brown bat, its fur covered in condensation, clings to the wall. It spent every winter of its life in this cave. The species has been known to live for up to 32 years. The animals are now left in peace to hibernate until the warmer weather of spring heralds their return to the outside world. Without doubt, the biggest threat to bats throughout the world comes from people. Cave-dwelling bats are especially vulnerable, whether they're hibernating in a winter shelter like Hubbard's Cave or raising young in summer nurseries like Bracken Cave. Bat populations are declining at an alarming rate worldwide, sometimes as a result of unintentional disturbance of caves, sometimes as the result of unfounded fear and deliberate killing. Bats have always had natural enemies. The bats start to get active before dusk and circle at the cave entrance. All the coach whip snake has to do is hang over the entrance and wait for a wing to touch its mouth. The snake may eat 3 or 4 bats in an evening, an insignificant toll on the millions passing by. It may take hours for all the bats to leave. A constant stream pours out of the cave and disappears over the surrounding countryside. It's staggering to think that they will eat over 250 tons of insects before morning. Those that are first to leave do so while it's still light, and so face other natural hazards. Red-tailed hawks patrol above the cave entrance and pick off the bats as they emerge. But again, the effect they have on the population is negligible. In the past few years, we have come to understand that our own survival on this earth is dependent upon the fragile ecosystems in which we live. And those ecosystems are dependent, in no small part, on bats. Not so long ago, bats filled the night skies almost everywhere on Earth. But in the last few decades, we've lost huge numbers and several species. And yet, it's not too late. Even last-minute acts of conservation can begin to restore bat populations. Their survival depends on us. And by saving them, we may well be saving ourselves.